Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second of the Environmental Justice Legislative Team briefings for in advance of the 2019 session. Our topic today is renewable energy strategies for Maryland, and we will be joined by a couple of our great partners, but let me be the first to welcome you. My name is Tamara Tolles O'Laughlin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Environmental Health Network. And we're based in Baltimore, but we work the entire state, and we are just one of the co-chairs and facilitators for the Environmental Justice Legislative Team, where we work together to magnify community voices through the legislative process to address environmental inequities in Maryland. We are an open group that welcomes participation from anyone who's interested in creating a more inclusive and equitable policy landscape. Our members include legislative champions, health professionals, and advocacy communities, but we are also open and affirming for anybody who wants to join us to talk about what's happening in the state of Maryland. Our founding members include Blue Water Baltimore, the Beloved Community Church in Accokeek, Maryland, Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility, Clean Water Action, Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, the League of Conservation Voters, and Chesapeake, Maryland, among others. As I mentioned, we're one of the co-chairs with Clean Water Action, and they will be hosting just several of the briefings towards the end of our series in December. As the Maryland Environmental Health Network, we are brought to this work because it feeds into our mission to promote the elimination of environmental threats to human health and our vision for a safe and healthy environment for all Marylanders. We are working with you through this and other means to level the playing field for vulnerable populations by creating a real pathway for communities who are looking for answers and advocates and others who are willing to underline what they're seeing, saying, and translate that into durable policy. What we're going to cover today will happen in 3 sections. They'll blend into each other fairly seamlessly, we hope. With the first 20 or 30 minutes between now and 12:20, we'll focus on what is it? What are we covering today? Renewable energy in the state of Maryland and the public health lens on it. Generally, what renewable energy portfolios do, what Maryland's does specifically, and then we'll open it up to some discussion where we'd like to hear from you. So you'll see that your unmute button is off after 12:20 because we want to talk openly about your concerns about renewables in the state. And we'll wrap the last half hour at 12:50 with emerging ideas and proposals from our partners, Tim and Brooke, and some questions and answers, as well as announcements for the next briefing. So just to recap, the first half hour is what is it? The second half hour is what do you think about it? And the final half hour will be what are we doing about it? So stay tuned. Our first partner is Brooke Harper, the Policy Director of the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. She is an advocate who speaks with her head and heart, a really fun partner who makes this feel a lot less like work. She graduated from York College in Pennsylvania and became an organizer as of 2007, organizing for all the things we care about, and she's here to talk about what that means in the renewable space today. Our other partner is from Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility, the Executive Director, Tim Whitehouse, who has more than 20 years of experience working on a wide range of environmental issues with governments, businesses, nonprofit organizations, and community groups. He speaks with a lot of force and vigor around population health issues implicated by renewable energy, and we're going to ask him to amplify some of the most salient issues in public health today outside of the network's broad spectrum interest in the topic. So let's talk about it. Why do we care about environmental health? Why do environmental health folks care about energy and renewables? Well, I think it's fairly well-worn topic to say that the environment impacts our health. What's happening in the air, what's happening with water and sanitation, chemicals, radiation, just noise, all of it forms the fog that we live our lives in, and environmental health looks at that, takes it apart, and figures out what the connecting factors are to give us the best chance at achieving longevity and health. We're specifically interested in population level health and what being in a specific place at a specific time does to a group's chances of survival and or a group's chances to thrive. We are specifically interested in those folks that are harder to reach here at the network. We call them vulnerable populations. And whether or not there are levers and signals that we send through the policies that we set that are directly connected to whether or not vulnerable populations can achieve health. We are taking a deeper dive into energy choice because what we value and what we don't value impacts the health of entire generations of Marylanders. The folks on the call today, some of you know it better than I do, but what we use as fuel, where and how we look for it, the ways we access it, and how we refine and transport it has an incredible impact on human health. And Maryland is in the middle of a really important moment as we make decisions about the future of Maryland through its energy choice. So as we are making these decisions in the policy space, it's important to think about who's included and who's excluded from planning, and why the inclusion or exclusion of those communities will have consequences, either that make the policies better or make them worse, that make people's health more or less on the table. And as they say, if you're not on the agenda, you're on the menu. So our goal in all of this is to lower the likelihood of untimely death and sickness while helping human beings to achieve the ability to have meaningful lives of their own making. We think it's important for communities to have a say in what happens where they are, because that is a key to community resiliency. Communities cannot simply be added on at the end of a process to determine whether or not it is useful or meaningful. And so we care about the outcomes for communities, we care about the existence of them, and as a result of it, we have to care about these issues. We are specifically interested in some threats that are emerging as we make choices in the state of Maryland. We hear from our members about proximity of communities to industrial activities, and not only being surprised that they are occurring, but being surprised at the level of impact it has on their daily lives. Everything from noise, light, air, and water pollution, we hear about it from our members who are increasingly interested in the rise of fossil fuel infrastructure, and specifically natural gas infrastructure. We're also concerned with energy costs that don't seem to take into consideration what it means for families who are already suffering from vulnerabilities of several kinds and are on trajectory to receive more to be concerned about, as we are or are not weighing in affordability in the calculation for what constitutes good energy policy. We are concerned about the lack of voice and agency for those communities, and whether or not community itself is lost by the change of land use so quickly in such a short period of time. We're also concerned about how extreme climate exaggerates existing inequities. If people already live near things that are harming them, North Carolina is a really great example. What's happening in the Carolinas is a really good example of what happens when policy excludes human health and then is exaggerated by climate change. There isn't a piece of paper you can find, a newspaper you can find, where we are not talking about what it means to have how we store the things we use to feed the food chain or to develop our energy portfolio, and what happens when unexpected climate events disrupt those plans. We are particularly concerned in Maryland about a lack of state and local health responsiveness from the agencies that are charged with doing just that. Whether or not they are listening to communities at the local level who are expressing community concerns, and whether or not they're taking up any data to prove the harms that communities are talking about, or else forcing communities to make those calculations on their own. So I'm going to take a breath and and suggest that we spend some time just in the background talking about what the heck is the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Before we have the experts weigh in and talk about what it means in Maryland, we should just think about it. This is the standard definition. It's a rule or order backed by a government agency with the force of law that increases energy produced from a renewable source that can include wind, solar, biomass, or other things alternatives to fossil and fuel and nuclear energy. It's also known as the Renewable Electricity Standard. That's a mouthful. So we think of it as a placeholder for the ways we want our energy to serve people. As a human-centered organization, it's important for us to think about it isn't just things that we're doing. It's a bucket or a wish list for good energy ideas. And usually it's aspirational until we build the regulatory framework underneath it that allows us to be able to achieve those targets that we've set. So if we set a target for state policy on power generation, we are also have to think about what that's going to mean for people who are in the balance of trying to figure out how to afford, how to pay for the electricity they already have, and how to stay in the conversation about the electricity they wish to enjoy in the future. So yeah, RPS is a lightning rod for a lot of conversation. But if you think about it as a wish list for good energy ideas or a placeholder for the things we want to do in our state, it helps to think about it as we get into more complicated discussions. And RPS only works as well as the incentives that support it. And if we are looking at developing an RPS that really and truly is aspirational, then we generally tend to depend on federal dollars to be able to support the production of the things we don't have already, to incentivize things that we'd like to see more of, and to partner with us when emerging technologies start out as expensive. As experts will tell you, as we are looking at what the Renewable Portfolio Standard in Maryland covers, we have reached parity. Some of this stuff isn't as expensive as it used to be, but that doesn't mean it's accessible to everybody, and there's a lot to say about that. So states often design the Renewable Portfolio Standard to push a specific technology, and they call that carve-outs. So you'll hear Tim and Brooke refer to carve-outs for very specific activities, whether that's biomass or solar. It's just a way that we incentivize a specific vehicle amongst other things when we're pushing for a new standard for renewables. So an RPS requirement may be directed at the entire grid, or it can be directed at a specific part of it. A state can take up its own design and define what technologies are eligible to meet the RPS requirement, and we'll talk very briefly about what our environmental health wish list might be for a renewable portfolio standard that does just that. Ideally, it would apply to the entire grid. It would have really stable targets that ramp up steadily over time. And the reason we're focused on stable targets is because we want to provide an on-ramp for technology to show up and respond to our wish list of things that we'd like to see, and to create some mechanisms that allow us to get investment that'll pay for it. We think it's important for a renewable portfolio standard to articulate what qualifies as renewable energy, and to be really clear in measuring the health impacts of each one of those things as a way to find out what the value proposition is for everybody, not just the most vocal folks. Also, we're looking for an RPS that provides credits for participation that are transparent and can be tracked. It's great to have amazing accounting, but if it's really difficult for communities to understand, then they cannot be supportive of policies. And so we are looking for our own renewable portfolio standard to do just that, and to fairly distribute the costs and burdens without bias. So we are looking for a renewable portfolio standard that does not continue to compound the impacts for vulnerable populations, either by the design of new technology, where it is sited, or how the siting of those activities impacts communities that are already in place. We're looking for a portfolio standard that is mandatory, that continues to impose penalties on those that fail to meet their requirements, and for those requirements to really be stringent, not just a slap on the wrist or a parking ticket for doing business. If we're looking at all of this through a health lens, it has to be more expensive to meet the requirements than it would be to produce a good thing. Otherwise, what are we doing? Maryland's RPS was enacted in 2004 and has been revised countless times since. So in Maryland, we're not just sitting on our laurels, we're making it work better. And the conversation we're going to have shortly is just another version of that, us trying to figure out how to make this thing work best for Maryland. It requires suppliers to produce a minimum amount of eligible renewables, and that means it's a floor, it's not a ceiling. We're not asking folks to only do what we're asking, but we're trying to set a basic standard so that we're continuing to improve the portfolio of Maryland and its ability to produce clean energy where we're standing. Everyone on this call is probably aware that 2017 was a big year for the RPS and the override because lawmakers overrided a veto by the governor and increased the portfolio standard to 25% by 2020, which is not enough, but it was better than the alternative. So eligible technologies in Maryland, what's in our RPS? It's divided into 2 tiers, and the buckets are organized fairly easily. It's a lot of things and then everything else. Tier 1 includes solar and wind, which we have carve-outs for in our state, biomass, anaerobic digesters, geothermal, ocean, fuel cells powered through renewables, small hydro, which is distinct from Tier 2 hydro, poultry and litter incineration, which is unique to Maryland, and waste to energy facilities, which is not. So I think I've talked long enough. It's probably time for us to just check in with each other and hear from the folks on the line about what Marylanders are feeling about all of the conversation that the advocacy community is having around renewable portfolio standards. Just 2 comments that we've pulled from things that we've heard from different communities. A recent editorial in the Sun said it's time to stop bamboozling and measure the state's renewable energy accomplishments, not just by paperwork, but by real investments in non-polluting energy production in our state. Conversely, folks are concerned about what happens if we don't have a renewable portfolio standard. Joanna Wormers from Rockville, Maryland said that she hopes no one suggests repealing the program because without it, we have not been able to have highly effective wind and solar projects. And she expressed a worry that we would have a catastrophic decline in investment without it. Those are just 2 different ends of the conversation around what's happening. So if you look at your screen, you'll find that you are allowed to talk. So I'm going to open up the mic so that you can. Okay. If you find that you are unable to talk, it may be because you have an elder, a more seasoned or senior version of Zoom. So this is a good opportunity for those of us who can to weigh in and talk about what are your concerns about the Renewable Portfolio Standard? I see some familiar faces, names, and voices here. And if for some reason you're banned, I can also look and read you can type a question and we'll discuss it. Brooke and Tim, while we're waiting to see what questions come in, what have you been hearing in your work around what people are concerned about?
Well, I think there's real movement in the state to act and act decisively, irrespective of what particular piece of legislation people support, whether it's a state bill or a local bill. So there's tremendous energy throughout the state at all levels of government and in churches and synagogues and mosques about addressing climate change. So we're really at an important point, and over the next few years, I'm very confident things will move in a good direction. in this state. And hopefully that's good enough to both propel Maryland and other states to join in.
Brooke?
I agree with Tim. There's a lot of support for renewable energy and it's around the Clean Energy Jobs Act and around increasing the RPS. In 2 weeks, I think over 70 faith communities are going to be participating and bringing the message of why we need to increase Maryland's RPS. I know in my own community, there's a lot of concern about how we're going to stop the onslaught of fossil fuel infrastructure here in Washington County and around our state, and people feeling the urgency to do something and to do something quickly. And I think just with all of the recent climate events from Ellicott City, I just had my parents come up here evacuating from Myrtle Beach, that we can clearly see that climate change is here and that we need to act quickly to do it. I know that there's other campaigns, specifically in Baltimore City, to stop incineration and to shut those down as a polluting source for those communities. And we're hoping to stand with them by removing the subsidies from RPS that go to those polluting structures. And I think there's also a lot of concern about jobs and equity. We know that with the economic downturn, that also has community health impacts as well. And so I think people really want to see the future of renewable energy and green jobs grow. I know for folks that I talk to out in the solar industry and in the field, they really want to work here in Maryland. And we know that, not having to commute out of state to work on renewable energy projects is really important, not only to sustain those families, but just to improve the quality of life for those folks. So that's just some of the things I'm hearing about the need and the urgent need, and not only to bolster our fight against climate change, but also to sustain our communities and our communities' families as well.
We've heard so much of that at the network. We've heard from medical professionals that we should be doing what's in the best interest of people's health. And why are we acting so slow? We've heard from community members who want to know, what is all of this going to do for me right now? If we're talking about a policy that is supposed to help us bring in more renewables, where are they going to go? People have questions about how will this improve my quality of life right now? I can barely get from point A to point B. Talk to me about where the jobs are going to come from. People ask a lot of questions. When will we get the jobs? Where will they go? How will I be trained on them? And I think as folks who work in the advocacy space, it does point us to a lot of important questions that we need to think about as we develop policy and how that rolls out into regulations, how quickly we can start to see some measurable deliverables for people who are not thinking about this as their primary vocation. And it looks like we have a question from John Barnes, who needs to leave. He says he's concerned about November's election for governor and resistance on offshore wind. So can either of you speak to how expanding renewable portfolio would or would not have an impact on the ongoing fight to get offshore wind here in Maryland?
So I think, speaking on behalf of CCAN Action Fund, the elections play a really pivotal role in the future of Maryland's energy systems. We know that Governor Hogan vetoed the 2016 legislation, that there's been a lot of resistance to offshore wind in Ocean City, but I think the elections probably won't impact the two current projects, but we need to put people into office. And again, speaking on behalf of CCAN Action Fund, we need to put people into office that are supporting clean energy policies, that want to see the hub brought here to Maryland for offshore wind and revitalize Baltimore. And I think having strong leaders in the governor's house as well as in our state houses will really impact the future of our renewable energy policy. We know that Governor Hogan is targeting folks so that we won't have the ability to do a veto override. And so I think just as critical as pushing for the strongest policy is pushing for the candidates that are strongest on clean energy. With the Clean Energy Jobs Act, we did do a lot of candidate pledges. So we are really excited that we've had over 133 candidates sign on, including including Ben Jealous, and keep driving home the point that clean energy should be a top issue on every voter's mind.
And I would just add a couple things. We're not we don't involve ourselves in elections, so I won't comment specifically on any election. But you know, as we look forward into what is it that's going to really save us and Maryland, in particularly with respect to clean energy, it's offshore wind and it's in-state solar. Both in terms of job development and economic growth. So as advocates out there, whether you're involved at the local level and bringing and making sure your local ordinances allow for the development of solar, or whether you're on the shore and fighting for offshore wind, that those are the two really big components that Maryland needs to make sure we develop. And also, as the prices of these energy sources decline, there are opportunities for bipartisan approaches, because traditionally, if you're not a climate denier and the price of these fuels sources become cheaper, hopefully where appropriate, we can find some in the years ahead. It's not going to happen right away. We can find acknowledgement by both sides that it's in our economic interest to switch rapidly to clean renewable energy, because solar and wind are getting much cheaper. I have no illusions that that's going to happen in the next year, but you know, we need to think long term here.
Have either of you seen any specific trends that would suggest that offshore wind in Maryland is threatened in the last year? Because I can tell you in our Johnton around Annapolis, just in the last year, we've seen a lot of mixed communication amongst community members who are trying to figure out if there is in fact going to be a health impact as we increase offshore wind, and it's been really difficult to break through the things that are being said about the health impacts of offshore wind versus the obvious benefits.
Well, I haven't actually heard any negative of health effects of offshore wind.
Incredibly, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of misinformation that flies around. I know for offshore wind siting, there's, you know, tremendous federal oversight and a tremendous amount of studies that go into making sure they're properly located. But I am not aware of any significant or any measurable health impacts of offshore wind, and certainly the benefits outweigh what our alternatives are, for sure.
Sure. The latest proposal was 18 miles offshore. So given that, it would be very difficult to quantify health impacts happening that far away from where human beings are generally. It tends to suggest that, as you pointed out, there is a well-worn regulatory structure and lots of great real-time examples of the benefits being far greater than any concerns might be. So it's just a matter of aligning our will, our information, and our policy, if I'm correct. Okay. I'll open it back up if anybody wants to comment or ask questions or weigh in. Otherwise, we'll move into emerging policies and legislative concepts that are responding to. Oh.
There's a chat question or comment. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, thanks.
So it's a comment. It says, because of the experience of how hot this summer was and Hurricane Florence, people are really beginning to believe that climate change isn't just a threat, it's happening. So the important question is, what approach to our energy will actually achieve the fastest transition to carbon-free, clean, renewable energy the fastest?
That's a meaty question. How we? I think the easy answer to that is the thing we implement the soonest. And outside of the universe of environmental policies that we can enact, there are actually tons of things that we could do that are well outside of policy, which are not the subject of this discussion. And I will, as an environmental health advocate, put it out there, like changing your diet, not buying fast fashion. I just want to point out that there are things outside the regulatory space that if we took them up as a group of sentient beings, we could probably do a lot to advance it. Probably third to that is transportation and climate, which we will cover in a fall briefing series on December 17th at noon. We're going to talk a lot about what it means to have transportation weigh in the balance of what's happening to protect us from climate. But do either you or Tim or Brooke have anything you want to say about the fastest action from your perspective before we jump into discussion of policy proposals?
So I agree with you, Tamara, that what can get implemented the fastest is how we're going to really change our energy and our environment. We need action quickly. I see the impacts here in my own community. We see it across the state. We see it with an administration that's currently trying to put an onslaught of fossil fuel infrastructure. And so we need strong policies that can combat that. For me and for CCAN, along with the other myriad of things that you suggested, including personal accountability, as well as reforming our transportation sector, we see the Clean Energy Jobs Act as being a key part of transitioning our energy sector in a fast way possible. We knew that with ours, it's a proven method that's been passed before, its political viability, and we're poised to pass it this year. And so we look at that as one of the ways that we can transform our sector quickly. I think on either side of the RPS debate, we know that we need to transition it quickly. My parents just had the threat of like Hurricane Florence on them, and they want to see a change in this. And so I think whatever can get us there and whatever we can implement is what will work. And I think the current RPS has a framework that's been proven to work, and 29 other states have activated the RPS as a way to quickly transform and build out renewable energy. I think the other proposal that's on the table is really wonderful too, but it's an entirely different framework that will take years to produce. So many folks remember our Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act fight. It was an entirely different framework. And we know in Annapolis, things don't move as fast as they should. It usually takes about 2 to 3 years for legislation to pass. So given that, plus getting legislators to shift to an entirely different framework, we believe that the Clean Energy Jobs Act would put us on the track there fastest.
Well, I'm going to ask a slightly spicy question just before we go into our policy discussion. What happens if we don't have the frames that any of us are presuming that we do? Like, I think there is some credible reason to be concerned with getting things done more efficiently. But as we've seen just from this last lineup of hurricanes that could have come and destroyed the Eastern Seaboard and the entire Eastern Caribbean, we're working on a time frame that even Seneca would say is less less than what we might imagine it to be. And so are we developing policies that respond to the crisis as it exists or to our politics?
I think both. I think you need to do both and have a balanced approach, because if we can't get the legislation passed, then there's nothing that's happening. And so it's really important, one, to put forward the strongest, most viable policies that you can. We are proposing doubling the clean energy, doubling the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and it was a bill that was just vetoed by our governor just 2 years ago. And so I think there's a need for political viability, and I think there's a need to act quickly. I think we see it with all of the onslaught of fossil fuel infrastructure that's continuing to come to our communities. And so we need to act fast. We need to act fast with things, with bold policies that can make it through the legislature.
Tim, you look like you might have something to say there.
Yeah, no, I would agree with what Brooke said. I mean, there's always the sort of both transactional nature of your work. You know, what can we do today? What's politically viable, and then what's transformational. And that's a constant struggle in any group, organization, or movement that's trying to bring about change. The only comment I would make is there are 29 RPSs, but they're all very different. And
Yes,
we can talk a little bit about that. So, and Maryland's RPS looks, you know, a little bit different than it did in 2009. And for us to address change the way we need to address it, hopefully it'll look much different in 2029, 2030. And so this is a continual process of improvement. We're continually learning about what works and doesn't work. And as prices of renewable energy fall, it'll change the economic landscape, perhaps in ways we don't quite understand yet. And also, as other states implement programs, it will affect our RPS, whether it's 100% RPS, 50% RPS, or whatever. So we are working in a very dynamic landscape, and as activists, we need to, you know, be aware of that and continually push the state to improve what it's doing.
Yes, so if we're setting aspirational goals, we have to be flexible. That's what it sounds like you're both saying. So happy to have agreement on that. We'll move into a discussion of specific policy models and specific things that we're thinking about as we look at the legislative session in 2019. For our 2 cents at the Maryland Environmental Health Network, I'll tell you, this is what we think about the bill proposal so far, is that there are multiple energy growth proposals, lots of things we want to do aspirationally to get us closer to protecting ourselves and the health of the most vulnerable. The commonality amongst these proposals is that everybody's looking to broaden the Renewable Portfolio Standard to make it cleaner, and is at least thinking about what it means to source some of that locally because of the impacts it has on jobs, because of the concomitant impacts that it will have on the social determinants of health and the community resiliency when you can name a thing, see it being built, and watch it happen in your lifetime. I think in terms of just highlighting differences between some of the proposals that we've heard, the rate of adoption for clean energy is a point of departure. Focusing on solving for in-state gaps is a thing that everybody's thinking about, but how it's showing up is different. We are specifically paying attention to affordability concerns as the policy proposal that goes forth. Whatever is successful, we are looking forward to some real considerations for what it means for people to have an equal need for energy, but not to have equal access to opportunity and affordability. And to translate good policy means to think about those who are least able to access it. We're also looking at the rate of transition from Tier 1, which Tim and Brooke will probably spend a good deal of time talking about our legacy in Tier 1 and why we need to focus on what clean really is if we're going to focus on human health and the protection of our species as we move forward. And with that, I'll move into Tim's presentation. If you just let me know when you want me to move on to the next slide, and I will.
All right, thank you. I was asked to provide some just overviews on framing public health and clean energy, and I'll move quickly through this, and then 2 or 3 slides on what is commonly referred to as the 100% proposal. I will just want to thank Brooke and Tamara up front. Both these organizations, as all of you on the webinar know, have been tremendously effective in driving the clean energy and the health issues forward in Maryland. So any disagreements we have are intended to make current policy better and kind of push the envelope on what we think Maryland can do. And I will also acknowledge up front, certainly the momentum is behind the 50% bill, no doubt about it. And to that extent, I will also acknowledge that both bills are currently being worked on. And so what is actually introduced in this legislative session, whether it's one bill or two bills, you know, will and should be different than last year, because we, whether it's CCAN or Chesapeake PSR or Maryland Environmental Health Network, are always looking to improve upon what we've done in the past. So there is an emerging consensus among all climate activists and scientists that we need to move to 100% clean electricity as quickly as possible, and to rapidly cut carbon emissions from all energy sectors. We often focus on electricity because that's something that's actually doable. Transportation, let's admit it, is much, much harder. But also, again, with declining prices in the renewable electricity sector, if we have the right policies in place, it's actually doable in a fairly short time frame. Now, that time frame is debatable, but it is something that's not impossible. It's not a pie in the sky. And of course, we know that the production of energy is, while it's allowed humankind to rapidly evolve in ways that are unfathomable 3 or 4 centuries ago, is also creating the greatest threat to human existence on the planet. And we need to rapidly address that. And the results are cleaner air and cleaner water. And if we do it right, economic and job development in Maryland. Maryland's been a huge importer of energy. And as we import energy into the state, we are losing out on the economic benefits of that energy production. And now that we can do it in clean ways, hopefully we can bring some of those clean industries into the state. So this is something I think all groups agree upon. And the last thing I'll just say is equity and opportunities and costs. And we can talk more about that. You know, both approaches, both bills last year had ways to address that. So we can move to the next slide. Hopefully, at least public awareness has changed in the last year or two. I don't know what the polling's saying, but you would think with what's coming in from the science and what we're seeing in our daily lives, that we know things are actually spiraling out of control more rapidly than even conservative estimates aggressive estimates were a decade or two ago. And we need to capture and continue to try and capture the space and organize and mobilize to address climate issues. So here are just some of the things that we know science is saying. I will just say, you know, the temperature warming 140% higher than thought in the 80s. Earth's oceans are warming faster. Ice is melting quicker. And we are seeing the decline of our atmospheric and ocean systems from what they were. And we as humans live in a very narrow space. We can tolerate actually little change in our climate. So you can switch to the next slide. We also know, and I think the climate community is well aware of this, and the environmental community, but it's something that does require education because it's still not obvious to many political leaders and many people in their day-to-day lives, but health and air pollution is a major cause of health-related problems, and particularly related to deaths, but also disease. And combustion for energy sources is the greatest form of air pollution, particularly coal and oil and gas. And so while we're trying to make great progress in that, many political leaders that are skeptical of climate change may understand or may be responsive to issues of air pollution in their neighborhoods. So we can see it causes lung cancer, respiratory problems, chronic obstruction pulmonary disease, heart disease, and stroke. And it's often communities that are poor and of color, or in the cities, or in rural areas near some of these production facilities that suffer the most. Next slide. So we think coal is dying, and let's hope it is. But we can't be sure, because there's a big push to make coal last as long as possible. And here's some information on coal and coal power and plant mortality. And if any of you are interested in digging deeper, please do. You can look at that site or get it from me. But clearly in Maryland, a lot of groups have been involved in coal-fired power plant issues. And coal has been declining in Maryland, but it's still a substantial part of our energy use. And Tamara disappeared. I don't know if I can control the slides there mysteriously. So the other thing I think probably most people on this call know, but it's not generally accepted when you get out of our circles, is that natural gas is not a bridge fuel. Natural gas was marketed as a bridge fuel. It was a public relations tactic. It was a brilliant tactic. But as the industry builds out billions of dollars of infrastructure, they are not viewing this as a bridge fuel, and they are not going to let go of that infrastructure. This is a highly profitable form for them in terms of constructing the infrastructure, and it's designed to build out natural gas in this country and build it out for export. And as has been mentioned in other parts of this call, we now know that, natural gas is certainly as bad or worse for the climate than coal, and the public health impacts from fracking to the compressor stations, to the pipelines, the export terminals, to the facilities that create the energy are tremendous, and we're only beginning to understand how detrimental natural gas actually is. I would also say there's also, although coal and natural gas are the big combustion sources, obviously, Chesapeake PSR is an anti-nuclear group, does not believe that nuclear power is a long-term viable solution, and that we should transition off of nuclear power as those current plants reach their life expectancy. And we also have biomass gas, which all major health organizations in the United States have signed pledges opposing. The burning of wood waste, for example, that's a significant public health issue. And black liquor, we'll talk about later, is used in the pulp and paper industry, and that's a very harmful form of energy production, which has RPS implications. Next slide. So the other thing is about talking about clean energy policies addressing energy burdens. So energy needs don't decline with income. Poor people need energy. Low-income households use more energy per square foot of heating than middle income or higher income. And they have less efficient energy appliances, and many elderly and low-income people or ill people, which are often low-income people, need to use more heat to keep their houses warmer. And we know that evictions, because of inability to pay utility fees, is a huge cause of the spiral into homelessness. And so energy although some of the burdens that middle class and upper class families can absorb, many lower income families cannot absorb that. And if they can't absorb it, it can lead to a spiral where they lose their lodgings and can end up in a very precarious economic situation. So energy costs can be 10 to 20% more for low-income families' income versus 3 or 4% for average Maryland income. One of the things we can talk about later if time permits, but the 100% bill last year proposed limiting energy burdens to 6% of gross income for eligible low-income households. That's a similar program to what is in New Jersey. So for low-income households, they would only pay 6%, no more than 6% of their gross income toward energy bills. Next slide. I think everyone's in agreement about these next two bullets, and the question would be, how to do it. Programs must bring jobs to Maryland. We should not lose out on the clean energy revolution, either on solar development in state or offshore wind production. There's probably not a lot of political will for onshore land-based large-scale wind production in Maryland. There might be some more development, but again, it's primarily offshore wind and solar where there's room for that. So currently, Maryland imports most of its energy. I may be wrong there. I think it's about 40%. But currently under RPS, most of the energy credits for RPS come from out of state. As I mentioned, so as we move forward, irrespective of what laws are in place, we need to make sure we're building out the clean energy economy in the state and bringing jobs back to the state. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about some of the policy concepts behind the 100% renewable bill. If there's a 100% bill that's not passed in the next few years, hopefully this is, I think, the concepts and the actual programs and policies that people in the state need to work towards. So 100% clean renewable electricity by 2035. It requires utilities to actually purchase increasing amounts of clean electricity each year. And there would be significant in-state carve-outs for solar and different types of solar and for offshore wind. It would allow for the power purchase agreements. There was some confusion last year about that. So I know Chesapeake PSR certainly supports the purchase of energy from out of state. It's necessary. We would hope to see the state move toward power purchase agreements, however, where the energy is actually being purchased as opposed to a credit system, which the Renewable Portfolio Standard currently relies on for out of state energy. We can talk more about that later. So wind down reliance on out-of-state energy. That was maybe edited from what I had, but wind down reliance on out-of-state energy, unbundled energy credits. So what that means is when energy is produced, it produces a renewable energy credit associated with it, because when energy comes into your home, it may not actually be clean energy. It may be from a local coal-fired power plant. But the way the market works is we work in a regional market that feeds into other regional markets. And there's credits associated with the production of renewable energy. And so those credits can be called bundled or unbundled. And so if utilities purchase energy, say a Maryland utility purchases wind energy from Pennsylvania, it can take the credits associated with that energy and retire them, and they can count toward Maryland's RPS. So you can only retire the credit once, so people don't use it twice. And so what we want to do is wind down our reliance on out-of-state unbundled energy credits. And the unbundled means that the utilities in Maryland and some other states are allowed to buy just the credit, not the energy.
And
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to, the reason that you're thinking about that is just because your focus is on getting more of the good stuff to happen in our borders. Is that right?
So, yeah, it's so partly there's the in-state carve out, but it's a little more than that, because if you allow companies to just buy the credits, you're not creating the new demand that you might otherwise create through the power purchase agreements. So if you have a state that has a 50% RPS that requires the actual purchase of 50% of your renewable energy, that will create a tremendous amount of increased demand locally or regionally than if you allowed credits to be purchased from energy that's already being produced and purchased elsewhere.
So this is about looking forward.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay.
And so, what we would like to see is an end to subsidies on all combustible energy sources. I know this is a huge issue. I know all the environmental groups have pushed for the removal at certain points of incineration and black liquor, and biomass less so, but that's something we need to start focusing on as it becomes more used in other states such as Virginia, and we buy their credits. And so we hope that there's a big push in this coming year or the next few years to remove some of these combustible energy sources. That doesn't mean those energy sources go away. It just means they don't have the benefit of receiving the subsidies from the credits that our current system allows for. And we can talk about that in more detail if people have questions. And also, if people want to know what black liquor is, that's a fuel source for the pulp and paper industry. Maryland buys about 4% of its black liquor credits from pulp and paper mill in Western Maryland. The other 96% come from paper mills in Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, I believe. So the subsidies for the solar, in-state solar, I didn't put any specifics up here. I was only asked to do a couple slides, but there are different ways to provide subsidies for in-state solar, and I think everyone that supports any form of clean energy believes in a strong, robust state solar development system that supports the development of solar energy. Other states have moved towards something called a megawatt block program, where there are different blocks, specific blocks of subsidies for utility scale, community solar, commercial solar, and residential solar to ensure the development of these wide-ranging systems in the state. The economics of the small system versus a utility scale system are very different. The blocks would provide transparent subsidies, and those subsidies would decline as those blocks are filled up. We currently rely on a renewable energy credit program. These programs provide, certainly benefits to the solar industry, and certainly in Maryland, they're supporting the current system. Other states are using another system that we can talk about that provides greater transparency and greater stability, in our opinion, to the markets over the long term. But we'll see how that develops in Maryland over time. And then limit energy burdens to 6% of gross income for eligible low-income households, which was discussed previously. So we can move on to the next slide. There's a lot on this slide. So I will allow it for people to, maybe bring this home if they want to. But we often talk about energy in terms of percentage. We started looking at it in terms of dollar amounts, and this is actually data given to us from the Public Service Commission. We've been using average data, average dollar amounts, but they actually provided us with the actual dollar amounts. I think that's the first time they've released this information. So this is on 2016, and this is what our current Renewable Portfolio Standard looks like. And over on the right, I've just written down some of the notes that we've talked about. But to get to 100% clean energy in Maryland, whether it's through the bill that was proposed last year or any other bill, we need to get rid of the combustible and dirty energy sources from the RPS, not just incineration, but also black liquor and wood waste. Now, if Maryland sticks with its current RPS system, and I should say the 100% bill doesn't get rid of the RPS, it just changes the mechanisms. It should ensure that energy credits bought by Maryland ratepayers stimulate new renewable energy and are not simply grants or subsidies. So what do I mean by that? When we look at some of the credits many of the credits that are being purchased currently by utilities, and it's perfectly legal, they may be from hydro plants that are being subsidized already by the state of New York, for example, or from a dam in Chicago that does not have a mandate to increase new energy, but is run by a municipal district for flood control purposes. Or it may be from an older wind farm in the Midwest that was built in 2008 and may already be financed. We don't know that. Or it could be from Dominion Energy burning wood waste and coal and selling that energy to customers in Virginia and selling the RECs to Maryland utilities to count for our RPS. So it creates a lot of issues about how to deal with these credits. And other states that have 50% RPSs have come up with a variety of ways, and they're still testing these ways, so nothing's perfect, about how to deal with these types of credits. And so New York has, the energy needs to be sold into New York. They can use unbundled credits, but it has to be sold into the state. California limits these unbundled credits to 10%. And so there's a real effort to look at how these credits are managed. Most states have a cutoff date where anything before this date can't be used, so you're not using old energy that may not need these subsidies. And Maryland does not. New York for Tier 1 is 2015. Many states, it's the date of the RPS passing in that state. So there's a lot. If we stick with the credit system, hopefully over time, we'll put more controls on the types of credits from a temporal perspective or from a geographic perspective or from a fuel source perspective that can really make sure we're stimulating new energy in a way that benefits Maryland ratepayers. So on the cost there, if you look at the different costs associated, just take black liquor. So in 2016, Maryland ratepayers paid about $19 million for black liquor credits. Now, again, about 95, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, went to out-of-state Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee firms. And so if you times that by 10 or 12, you're getting up to $190 million. And that's really lost opportunity cost. To really take that Maryland ratepayer money and make sure it's invested in Maryland. Now, it's a huge lift. Let's make no bones about it that the United Steelworkers wants to keep black liquor in. It benefits their members. But there is a real question about why we're supporting pulp and paper mills in Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee when those states don't provide similar subsidies. And also, if you look at wood and solid wood waste, you have $6 million in 2016. This is the latest available data we have. So there may be other data out there, but this is the latest we have. So even if wood waste and wood solids stay the same, this is all out-of-state money for 10 years. That's that's $60 million. That's significant. And so again, these are types of long-term or short-term issues we do need to face head-on. I will say for black liquor, Maryland is the only state that allows it as Tier 1. Pennsylvania allows black liquor, but it has to be from in-state, and in DC it's called Tier 2, so it's less significant. Hydro, in our opinion, has a lot of problems too. Some of the hydro wrecks are from old dams, from throughout the East Coast, and we really need to look at making sure our money is being spent effectively as we buy credits from these small hydro facilities, particularly in states that provides incentives on their own. And for these facilities, and these tend to be very small local development type of projects. So that's a lot of information to digest, but it's certainly, the current RPS, we believe if we stick with it, we need to continually work to improve it, and we need to continually work to tighten up the restrictions that Maryland has, which are some of the loosest in the country on how they use these renewable energy credits. So that's all I have. I do have this last slide because, as all of us involved in the environmental or climate movement know, we're all working toward a better state, and there are different ways to get there. And if we wake up tomorrow and find out it's all a big hoax and Donald Trump was right, and we've created a better world, well, all the more to us, although we now know it's not even a hoax, so that's probably not even funny. But but I found it amusing. So, we're all working toward the same thing, and we will get there, but we all, will fight to get there, and it will be a continual process over the years. The RPS has been amended many, many times, and as we move forward, it probably will be amended many times more.
Yes, as we transition to Brooke, what I'm going to pull out from what you said is that essentially we are all trying to make the aspirational document a lot truer, as we are moving towards a renewable portfolio standard that represents the things we care about. We want to make sure that more of the benefits land right here in Maryland, and more of the health protections stay here as well. So thank you so much, Tim. We'll probably be back with questions and answers, but I want to give Brooke a chance to start to talk about her emerging proposal. Brooke?
Great, thanks, Tamara. So I just wanted to talk about the Clean Energy Jobs Act with you all. There's 4 primary provisions to the Clean Energy Jobs Act of 2018. The first, as you all know, is to increase the Maryland RPS to 50% by 2030 to phase out incentives for refuse-derived fuel and municipal waste-to-energy incineration, and then to create jobs by investing in workforce development and apprenticeship programs, and then providing grants to small, veteran, minority, and women-owned businesses entering the clean energy economy. You can go to the next slide, Tamara. So why do we need, and I think, Tim, you covered this pretty well in your presentation as well, we need to increase our renewable portfolio standard because Maryland is still importing most of its electricity and powering our homes and communities with dirty fossil fuels. And we need to increase the amount of renewable energy because it has a whole host of health impacts, of climate impacts, and equity and justice impacts when we rely on dirty fossil fuels to power our homes and communities. You can go to the next slide. And as Tim said, there's a lot of health consequences to the generation of dirty fossil fuels. So Maryland's reliance on dirty energy for electricity generation has basically created an environmental crisis in Maryland. 85% of Marylanders live in areas that fail to meet EPA's National Clean Energy Standards. We're ranked 5th in the most toxic air pollution from power plants. And we have the dubious distinction of having some of the highest levels of ground level ozone pollution on the East Coast. And then we also see that electricity generated from dirty energy has far-reaching implications that devastate public health or severe weather and disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color. If you look at some of the public health impacts, we have the greatest number of premature deaths due to air pollution. We pay millions of dollars in charges for asthma-related hospitalization, and it's estimated that there's about 113 deaths per year from air pollution. from cars, trucks, transportation, and the way that we power our homes. And I think it's about 113 deaths annually, with about a decrease in lifespan by about 10 years. Go to the next slide, Tamara. And just with some of the environmental impacts that we see, I think all of us have experienced flooding over this summer in some extent or another, but we're in a dire state right now with rising sea levels, and over 53,000 people and 40,000 homes are at risk. And sea level is expected to rise another foot by 2050. We've all seen the extreme weather in Maryland over the summer and throughout the winter, and we'll continue to see those unless we act now and act urgently. The next slide. Some of the things that we see, especially, is that dirty fossil fuels are normally placed in low-income communities, communities of color, and rural communities. And we see that there's an environmental injustice that occurs. So minorities and the poor, they suffer more during extreme weather events. You might have just seen some instances with Hurricane Florence about how people couldn't evacuate because they actually didn't have the funds to evacuate. Oftentimes they have fewer resources to prepare for and recover from extreme weather events. We find that minorities and low-income communities breathe dirtier air. And when there's fossil fuels like gas prices go up, heating costs go up, then we find that, low-income and communities of color are primarily spending more of their income on the basic necessities. And also because of climate change, they have fewer shifting job opportunities. So we see that a lot of folks are employed in either the retail or the agricultural sector. And so when climate change impacts happen, those workers are usually some of the first that are fired if there's an economic downturn, or let go if there's an economic downturn due to climate change. So with the Clean Energy Jobs Act, what we're trying to do is to double the RPS to 50% by 2030. Next slide. So the benefits to public health would include an additional $8 to $22 billion per year in health benefits, improve Marylanders' health by reducing emissions of toxic air pollution and other harmful chemicals, and prevent 290 premature deaths annually, and that's supposed to be 3,000 asthma attacks. And then, as I mentioned before, a core tenet of our bill is to remove waste to energy incineration from the RPS. It's costly and harmful and has no place in the RPS. And when we did the modeling for that, we found it would prevent 7 to 16 deaths per year, 1 to 8 non-fatal heart attacks, and 188 asthma episodes. And it also, if we're taking out waste to energy incineration, it's going to increase incentives for wind and solar. And we were very fortunate to have the support of both Baltimore City and Montgomery County, which are home to the two incinerators in our state, supporting the Clean Energy Jobs Act and initiatives to remove waste to energy incineration. In fact, Montgomery County, which is the jurisdiction whose constituents would actually have a fiscal impact, actually submitted testimony in favor of the Clean Energy Jobs Act and the proposal to remove waste to energy incineration. The other core part is part of, the promise of solar energy. Our bill proposes that we increase the carve out from 2.5% to 14.5%. We have the backing of the Maryland solar industry and their companies supporting and helping us to craft this legislation so that we have a solar energy policy that not only creates jobs, they predicted it would create about 19 to 20,000 jobs, maintaining and creating new jobs throughout the lifetime of the bill, and continuing Maryland's promise as a solar state. One of the things that we found is in the last year, we were actually one of the states to lose solar jobs. in the Mid-Atlantic aside from West Virginia. And we don't want to see folks that are having to go and work in New Jersey or DC and other markets where that solar renewable energy credit is more value. We want to stabilize the market here, build those jobs here, and to stabilize our solar industry. And MDVCA, which represents a lot of the rooftop solar, and USEC, which represents a lot of the large-scale utility solar. They're both united and worked really hard on the proposal to determine what's best for their market and how can they protect their employees and their investments. So next slide. So you can go to the next slide too, sorry. So as Tim said, you know, we are also, both sides are recrafting their bills right now. So one of the things that we're looking at and that the wind industry just concluded was that we need to be competitive in order to bring the hub of jobs and the supply chain to Maryland. And so while we did have initially a 250 to 500 megawatt carve out, one of the new provisions in the Clean Energy Jobs Act will be to increase that offshore wind carve out to about 1.2 gigawatts and still keep that along with the solar carve out increase to protect ratepayers below that $2 cap that we had last year. And then could you switch to the investing in our, oh, you got it. And then this is a really big part of our campaign that we worked on. We worked on with fund managers across the state and consulting with different job training agencies, but we really wanted to make sure that as we grow our renewable energy industry, that we're not growing in equity. And so a core component of our bill that didn't get passed in 2016, we've bought back. And that's one, investing in small women and veteran and minority owned businesses. So we've invested $17.2 million that are available for capital grants and loans so that people of color and small business owners and women, they can not only be workers in the solar industry, but they can be owners of the solar companies as well. And we also know that as we grow our renewable energy industry, we're growing the demand for workers and well-trained workers. And so we have $7 million that we'll set aside for workforce development. Some of that will go through a tax credit apprenticeship program to offer apprenticeships for folks that want to be employed in the renewable energy industry and for companies that want to employ those folks that they train. We'll also be working to allocate funds for career and technical schools. So students that may not be college bound can still be participants in the renewable energy industry. And then building on our previous policy of allocating funds through the EARN program. And we've already seen that program work here in Hagerstown, where I live. That's been used to start up a solar installation certification program at our local community college in Baltimore. We've seen the beneficiaries of that program with Power 52 and Civic Works, and we hope to continue on to that success. One of the things that's come up a lot in this debate, because of course we don't want to see combustibles, we don't want to see black liquor, and so we've really had to kind of balance how can we get a bill past the finish line and take a really hard look at what is growing underneath the Clean Energy Jobs Act. So if you look at the first chart here in 2016, it looks like we're not doing very well. And I think a lot of folks have pointed this out that, you know, if you look at 2016, it looks like, you know, over half of our renewable energy, or a little less than half, is coming from dirty renewable sources like biomass and black liquor, but we still need to give the program time to grow and mature. So that's where Maryland's at about 12%. So we have about 7% of energy sources that are clean and green, and then about 5% that aren't. But as we grow that to 20%, and if you look at the 2020 retirements just under the current statute, you'll see that what we're really using to satisfy those requirements is primarily wind and solar. And so that drops from about that 48% to about 20% of that 25% target will be met by green, clean, renewable sources. And under the Clean Energy Jobs Act, less than 10% of our RPS will be coming from those combustible sources while we're driving up the demand for wind and solar. So I'm happy to take questions, and I'm sure there are questions, but if you like to get involved with the Clean Energy Jobs Act, feel free to contact me, and I'm sure tomorrow I'll be happy to connect you with me if you email her.
Yes, happy to open up for questions if there are any, but I have just one for the both of you. How does your bill specifically deal with residents' concerns about public health now? For folks who are trying to plan for the future but are worried about both proposals talked about COPD and asthma. The World Health Organization has said that the top 5 things that can kill you are all related to air quality, and 3 of them are inside of your house. So if we are concerned about how that shows up in asthma and missed school days, but we are not necessarily doing the work to connect the long-term impacts of this to heart disease, which is the #1 killer of women and is very much related to all of this. Are there specific parts of your bill where you are pushing the needle when you could avoid doing so? Because that's what's going to help people jump on to a coalition to be a part of a bill proposal, is wondering, what is it going to do for myself and my community, and how soon am I going to start to feel the benefits of this proposal?
Yeah. So we have over 660 organizations signed on to the Clean Energy Jobs Act because we did do that grassroots level coordination and organization. For the 2016, we educated and worked with the Greater Baltimore Asthma Alliance to teach them, how does this policy impact you, and how does it impact public health? And we spent a lot of time on the ground, especially in Baltimore City, talking to residents. I know I personally wanted our community events to be more reflective of the communities that we were holding them in. And for me in Baltimore City, that meant reaching out to sometimes low incomes and communities of color. And so we talked about the job growth, we talked about the health impacts, and that's how we really drew people into this coalition. And I think it takes, first of all, a real commitment to sometimes getting out of our environmental silos and hitting the doors and, hitting the streets and going to community association meetings to bring people in. And we did that a lot. And I think that played a big role in how we were actually able to craft our policy. When we looked at how much wind and solar can we grow, we talked to those industries. When we looked at how can we actually ensure that, when we have a training program, that it's successful. So we went out and talked to Civic Works, and when we looked at how can we make sure that women and minorities are meaningful participants in the renewable energy programs, we went out to the fund managers and talked to them. So I think by engaging with the public, they can see the benefits because we're pushed by them in order to make those changes and in order to design the best policies that will have the greatest impacts on those communities that we're trying to make change for. So I think it's number one, you make the most change by engaging those communities at the ground level.
Awesome.
This is Tim. In terms of health impacts, I mean, the big difference is in whatever bill's adopted, we as a state need to move toward the direct purchase of clean energy and move away from the unbundled credits. That is the only way we're going to get to 100%, and that is the only way we're going to make sure that Maryland ratepayers are actually getting clean energy delivered into the grid. The credit system does not guarantee that new clean energy is being delivered into the grid, with the exception of the in-state carve-outs for solar and offshore wind. So that's a huge difference. And whether it's this year or next year or 2025, we need to move toward a system where utilities purchase clean energy. And that will have the greatest health impact. And we need to make sure our neighbors do it also, because unfortunately, we do live in a grid that utilities purchase energy from all over the grid, and we still have coal-fired power plants in the state, and those could very well be here for a long time with a 50 or 100% bill, because utilities in other states can buy that energy. So it's a very complicated question. It's something that requires Maryland to move, but other states to move, and it requires utilities to be required to purchase clean energy, whether it's offshore wind, whether it's in-state solar, or whether it's wind from the Midwest, but it's an actual purchase as opposed to a credit.
Brooke, can we talk a little about affordability and what your proposal will do to amplify the conversation that was started by the 100% group around 6% around a 6% cap, and thinking about what people's disposable income is, because that speaks to some of the issues that you discussed, which is having a great vision for the future, but having people be able to participate today.
Yeah. I'd be happy to talk about that. And one of the things that we did was we looked at what are the ratepayer impacts. And when we started negotiating with the wind and solar industry, one of our bottom lines was that it had to protect ratepayers. And so, with our policy, even with the 1.2 gigawatts of wind and the 14.5% solar carve out, what we did was we lowered the alternative compliance payment fee. And if I'm speaking wonky talk, that's the fee that utilities have to pay when they don't purchase renewable energy credits. And so we put up that guardrail or that backstop in order to protect low-income ratepayers. And we really admire the 6% income cap that the 100% brought up. But one of the things that we had concerns with was that it wasn't fully funded. And so when we wanted to come up with a plan that's been proven to help ratepayers, and that, one of the things lawmakers look at every year is that dreaded fiscal note, or in other words, the price of the bill. And so while looking at what was going to be palatable to legislators, we knew that we had to keep that ratepayer income low, just for not only just low income communities, but also for moderate income families, and to protect them as well. And so we worked diligently with the solar and wind industry to keep those costs low, to protect ratepayers, and we determined that for, it'll be between about $1.47 and $1.85 at the peak years for that, because we wanted to know exactly what the cost would be for our bill.
And just one final question to you both. What, if anything, does your bill need to succeed? If there was one thing that you could ask the 20 or so folks who are in the webinar to do, what would it be?
I would say come to Annapolis, one, vote, two, come to Annapolis and make your voices heard, be an advocate for clean energy. None of these movements have been progressed without your voice. So tell your legislator why you care so much about clean energy, because it makes a difference. We can't move forward on policies if they don't get passed.
Tim? Thanks, Brooke.
It will require time to have the concepts, I don't know about the bill, but the concepts embraced. It will require challenging authority, including Democratic leadership authority. And it will require a greater understanding of how, when the prices of wind and particularly utility scale solar come down, that the mechanisms by which we purchase that energy in our RPS need to change, because as these energy sources become competitive or even more competitive, we need to require the utilities to stop buying credits and to start purchasing the energy. And that will lead to a huge increase in demand and change the business dynamics of the clean energy sources in the state.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for making time to talk with us. It sounds like what we need are guts all around. Yes. In order to get the hard work done. What you will see on the screen scrolling are resources. We are happy to share this recording and the following resources on what a renewable portfolio standard does, what Maryland's does compared to other places, and if you pair that with the great conversation we've had today around what we need to do, you start to get a picture of what is going to be required of us in the new year. Our next briefing will be on October. I don't think that date is right. Will be on October. That date is really long. Well, the topic will be community solar, which is a really great follow-up to this conversation because it's about advancing one of the most important ways that we are going to think about this work and what we have to do next. Our next briefing is October 8th at noon, and we'll be talking about what community solar means in the urban and rural context with Jessica Ennis of Earth Justice. So I thank everyone for tuning in. Our previous webinar on the Maryland Green Amendment will also be available by the end of this week. So you should be able to look in at the larger landscape, draw in on what we need to do on a renewable portfolio standard, and begin thinking about community solar as we ramp up to the next legislative session. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Brooke. Bye-bye. Thanks, Inga.